So good morning, welcome, and thank you for joining us for the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA Preventive Controls Rule Qualified Exemption webinar. We are very pleased to have Dr. Erin DiCaprio from the University of California, Davis, Dr. Stephanie Smith from Washington State University, as well as Scott Rice and Sarah Morrison from the Washington Department of Agriculture Organic Program. And we will be getting to the webinar presentation shortly, but first I'm going to go through a few quick housekeeping items. And just to let you know, we were going to turn off the videos during the presentations, but we wanted to just show you that there are faces behind the voices, and we'll be back on during the question and answer sessions. So thanks for joining. And with that, we'll start with some of the housekeeping items. So my name is Megan Donovan, and I will be your host today. Behind the scenes, we have Larissa Hernandez providing technical assistance. She'll be the one fielding questions when they come in and may hop on as an alternative host if any technical difficulties arise. The CCUF Foundation is pleased to collaborate with our partners to host this webinar. Guided by the wisdom of our farming roots, the CCUF Foundation unites the organic community to advance organic agriculture. We offer intentional education, financial support, and growth opportunities for organic professionals. We wanted to acknowledge that today's webinar is supported through a Food Safety Outreach Program grant from the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture. Please note the contents of the webinar do not necessarily reflect the official views of the USDA. And also note this webinar is not providing legal advice. If you're having difficulties connecting to the webinar, if you can't hear or can't see, please call our office for support at 831-423-2263. Press 0 for the operator and someone will help you connect to the webinar. And finally, a quick Zoom tutorial. I know most of you are probably Zoom experts by now, but sometimes there can be a few tricky things, so we'll just go through it really fast. To see the Zoom webinar controls, move your mouse over the image of the shared screen. If you're in full screen viewing mode and would prefer to view the webinar in a window, click on the View Options tab at the top of the shared screen and select Exit Full Screen Mode to exit the full screen. Throughout the webinar, we will stop from time to time for questions and answers. To send in questions or to communicate with our webinar staff, click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the shared screen. The question and answer box will pop open. Move it to the side of your screen if it blocks the webinar. Write your questions or comments in the field at the bottom of the box and click send. If you'd like to send your question anonymously, click the send anonymously box to the left. Note, we'll not be using the chat function for this webinar, so if you have any questions or comments, just use the question and answer box. And feel free to send in questions at any time. We'll collect them and then use them when we stop for the question and answer breaks during the presentation. At the end of the webinar, an invitation to take our evaluation survey will pop up. To take the survey, click on the link and answer a few quick questions to help us improve our offerings. And as a final reminder, today's webinar is being recorded. We'll send a link to the recording along with a PDF of the slides to all webinar registrants. So you'll have those as a resource. And just to note, we have a good group of folks online today, and we're going to try to get to as many questions as we can. And we just want to say if we can't get to your specific question, we apologize in advance and encourage you to follow up with us after the webinar. So thanks again for attending. And with that, I'd like to introduce our lead trainer. Erin DiCaprio is an assistant specialist in cooperative extension in the Department of Food Science and Technology at the University of California, Davis. Her area of expertise is microbial food safety with an emphasis on foodborne viruses. Joining Erin today are our Washington project partners, Dr. Stephanie Smith from Washington State University as well as Scott Rice and Sarah Morrison from the Washington Department of Food and Agriculture Organic Program. And they'll be jumping in from time to time to share Washington specific information or to answer any questions specific to organic. So with that, I'd like to hand things over to Erin, and we look forward to the presentation.
Thanks, Megan. Good morning, everyone. So our webinar today is going to focus on qualified exemptions under the FSMA Preventive Controls rule for human food. And so just a kind of a brief agenda for what we'll be going through today. We'll start with the definition of qualified facilities under the Preventive Controls for Human Food rule. We'll walk through calculating the average annual sales to determine qualified facility status. We'll discuss filing a Form 3942A with FDA. So this is the facility attestation form you need to submit to FDA, letting them know that you are a qualified facility. And then we'll end just covering what the requirements are under this preventive controls for human food rule for qualified facilities. So there are modified requirements to the rule for these types of facilities. We'd like to start with a quick poll. So I'll ask Larissa to go ahead and launch that. So this poll, what does the business you are affiliated with process? And this isn't an exhaustive list by any means, but let us know if you're primarily producing jams, jellies. Are you working with pickles, canned fruits or vegetables, just so we can get a sense of what everybody in the room is producing. And we'll give it another couple of seconds here. So I'm seeing dried fruits and veggies. That's definitely a popular type of processing we see here in California. So let's go ahead and end this. And I'll share results here. So a good number of people making jams and jellies, a lot in that other category. Fermented fruits and vegetables, one of my particular favorites. So a real diversity of what's going on with businesses in attendance today. And in the previous webinar, we got into a little bit of kind of the nuance of how what you're processing impacts how these regulations apply. So if you weren't able to attend last week, I encourage you to check out that recording for a little more information in that regard. So just a refresher here on what we covered last month on food processing and the FSMA Preventive Controls for Human Food rule. So there are some food processors that will be fully exempt from this particular rule. The first category of processors that has an exemption are processors that are doing some type of processing that is allowable on a farm and would be covered by the produce safety rule. And we talked about this in the previous webinar, but this is a very limited list of processing. The second type of full exemptions to the preventive controls for human food rule are processors that are doing that processing in a retail food establishment. So if this was a grocery store, for example, that was doing the processing, they would be exempt from the preventive controls for human food rule. And the third category of processors that would be exempt from this particular rule are those that are processing under a state's cottage food law. So the majority of states do have some type of cottage food law and the types of foods allowed and the amount of annual sales allowed for production under this cottage food law is going to vary state to state. So I would refer you back again to that first webinar where we touch on the Washington State cottage food law. So other than those situations, a food processor will be covered by the Preventive Controls for Human Food rule. However, there are some modified requirements to this regulation for facilities that meet the farm mix type facility definition, which we covered in the first webinar, and I'm not going to go too in depth to today. And the other situation where there would be modified requirements is for a qualified facility as defined under this rule. And so today we're going to be focusing in on these qualified facilities. So just another quick poll here. So what FSMA compliance category does the business you are affiliated with fall under? So this, you might already know you're a qualified facility. You might already know you're fully subject to the preventive controls rule. You might also be unsure, and that's why we're here today, to help clarify some of that. So we'll give just another minute here for this poll. I'm going to go ahead and close that, and I'll share the results. And so we do have a number of folks that already know they're going to be a qualified facility. Some folks that are going to be fully subject to the preventive controls rule. A good number of folks that are unsure. And again, that's why we're here today. And some folks where this is not applicable. So let's get into the weeds here a bit. And start getting into, how this qualified facility designation plays out. And I do want to point out here that beyond these food safety regulations, organic food processors also have several other considerations in meeting those organic requirements. So I would just suggest, checking in with your organic certifier throughout the process of establishing your business or building your business to make sure that, all the chemistries you're using in post-harvest operations or for cleaning or sanitation fall within the organic requirements, as well as any of the ingredients you're using in your formulated product. So when this broad blanket FSMA Food Safety Modernization Act was being developed, there was at least some recognition that the implementation of this regulation needed to be appropriate to the scale of the business. So in the FSMA Preventive Controls for Human Food rule, there's a provision that sets modified requirements to this rule for very small businesses. However, there is, this overarching expectation that as a food processor, you have the responsibility to ensure that the food that you are producing is safe. As I mentioned in our FSMA 101 webinar, the number of individuals that consume your product, i.e. the size of your business, is directly related to the risk of public health. So the more people that consume a product, the higher the risk to public safety if that product is not produced in a safe manner. Also, of course, there are different types of foods that are considered lower risk compared to others. Higher risk food types like low acid canned foods are always going to have very rigorous food safety regulations that apply to their production, just because of the inherent risk of those types of products. So again, I would refer you back to that first webinar for a little more detail there. So to help reduce some of the burden for very small businesses, the Preventive Controls rule defines the criteria for a qualified facility. So these are very small businesses as defined in the regulation and are subject to modified requirements. So these modified requirements include following good manufacturing practices, as well as filing with the FDA. The qualified facilities do not have to conduct a hazard analysis and implement preventive controls as defined under the rule. However, they still need to address hazards in their food product, and I'll provide information on what's required there a little later on in today's webinar. So to be eligible for this qualified facility designation, a business has to meet one of these two criteria. The first, and I think most widely utilized, is having less than $1 million in annual sales of human food. And this number of 1 million is adjusted based on inflation. So that $1 million threshold was based on 2011 values of food. The second criteria that can make a facility eligible for the qualified facility designation is to have less than $500,000 in annual sales over the last 3 years and be selling a majority of that food directly to a qualified end user. And so as defined in the regulation, a qualified end user is direct to consumers, to restaurants or retail food establishments in the same state as the facility, or not further than 275 miles from that food processing facility. I know that the text here is a bit hard to read, but I want to refer everyone to the FDA's Qualified Facility Attestation website. So here you can find FDA guidance documents, instructions for submitting the form 3942A, which we'll talk about here today as well. And you can also find the inflation adjusted cutoff numbers for the years since 2011 that FDA updates every year in April. So we set the stage for defining a qualified facility. So now I want to get into how one determines if that criteria is met. So first off, the FDA is not going to make this determination for you. A business owner is responsible for doing the calculations to determine if they meet the qualified facility criteria. However, the FDA will verify this information, so it's important to keep that paper trail of how you made the determination, because FDA may be looking for you to provide that information justifying your filing as a qualified facility. So the calculation for annual sales of human food needs to be done every year. And it's defined in the regulation that this calculation needs to be done no later than July 1st of each calendar year. So this is something you're going to have to be doing on an annual basis to make sure you still meet those qualified facility sales thresholds. So the calculation includes all human food that's sold or is currently being held in your inventory. This includes all human food, regardless if that food is covered by other food safety regulatory oversight. So you would include all foods that fall under the FSMA Preventive Controls for Human Food rule in that calculation, as well as other foods that might be covered by other food safety regulations, such as juice that would be covered by juice HACCP, or meat products that would be covered by USDA food safety regulations. So all of those foods need to be included in your annual sales calculations. So how do you calculate this average annual sales? So first you need to determine which 3 years to include in your calculation. Then for each one of those years, you need to determine the market value of your food processed, packed, or held. And then those numbers would be adjusted for for inflation for each one of those years. And then finally, you would calculate the inflation adjusted average of annual sales over that 3-year period. So the average is based on the 3-year period preceding the applicable calendar year. So we're in 2021. So for the calculation for this year, you would use 2018, 2019, and 2020 to calculate the average annual sales. If you've not been in business for 3 years, you would calculate that average based on the preceding 2 years, or you would base it on the previous year if you've only been in business for 1 year prior, and use that as your average annual sales. If you're just starting out as a business, FDA does allow for you to estimate what that annual average sales number would be. And, that could be justifiable as, your qualified facility justification. So you do need to have a lot of documentation to make this calculation. And all of that information needs to be available to FDA if they request it. Also important to note here that the calculation does not get adjusted for the cost of sales. So for example, you wouldn't adjust the total sales for the cost of labor of running your business. You also don't remove the cost of food that's sold direct to qualified end users. So if you're selling, a portion of what you're processing wholesale, you would include that in the calculation, but you would also include any sales going direct to grocery stores or restaurants in that calculation as well. So how do you adjust those annual sales for inflation? So FDA does publish an average for the current calendar year for the implicit price deflator for the gross domestic product on their website. So I tried to follow the directions on the website for using this particular table, and I did not find it user-friendly. But I would, if you're working on these calculations, try and work through this on your own, because, I think FDA is trying to guide people to use this table that they're providing. But the way that I've instructed folks to do this calculation in the past, I think is a little more straightforward. So for each year that you're including in your calculation, you would multiply the sum of the annual sales plus the market value in current US dollars by the 2011 implicit price deflator index number, and then divide that by the implicit price deflator number for the current calendar year. So the value you get out of this calculation is your annual sales plus market value in 2011 dollars. So i.e. this is your inflation adjusted sales number for the year that you're doing the calculation. So if this was 2018, that would be your 2018 market value adjusted for inflation. And then once you've done that calculation for each year, you're including in your 3-year average, you would simply sum all of those adjusted values and divide that by 3 to get your 3-year annual average adjusted sales number for inflation. And so if that number is less than 1 million, you're a qualified facility. So the math can definitely be challenging, and these are very simplistic examples. The FDA guidance documents on their website has a number of other examples that you can reference to help you walk through those calculations. So I just wanted to give a couple of examples on, what you would include when you're calculating this number. So in this example, we have a jam producer that sells to local restaurants as well as wholesale. And so to calculate the average annual sales and market value, you would include here the sales to local restaurants, wholesale, as well as any inventory that's currently being held. And so in this case, the annual sales and market value is less than $1 million. We're below, so we're in that qualified facility criteria. So less than $1 million in annual sales. In this example, the jam producer is also making juice and selling eggs. So juice is covered by FDA HACCP regulations, and eggs are covered by USDA regulations. However, all of the sales associated with these foods, even though the juice and the eggs are exempt from the preventive controls rule, would be included in that average annual sales and market value calculation. We also would include, of course, the sales to qualified end users as well as wholesale. So in this case, we're above that $1 million threshold. And so this particular facility would not be eligible for the qualified facility designation. So of course, with any regulation, right, there's also always a lot of documentation required. And so a qualified facility is required to show FDA that a business meets this definition. And so we'll go through what documentation is required for that here. So records are required to support the attestations that are going to be made on the form 3941A. So this is the form, the Qualified Facility Attestation form that's going to be submitted to FDA. So you need to keep records that you used for making the calculations. So tax records, sales records, that type of thing, as well as the actual calculations that you made. So you need to keep that math handy for FDA should they ask for it. So these records are subject to the record keeping requirements under the Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule. So this means, they need to be accurate, legible, indelible, and that you need to keep them essentially for 2 years after they were created. But I have a slide on what's required for records a little later in today's webinar. So I just want to walk through the form 3942A really quickly. This form is available online, so you can download a hard copy, fill it out, mail it to FDA. There's also an electronic version that you can submit online, which is FDA's preferred method of submission. But the first page includes information like the FDA facility registration number. So you do have to register with FDA as a processing facility. And then, of course, provide information on the facility, like its name, the address, telephone number, that type of thing. And then the type of submission this is. So is this the initial submission, the first time you're submitting this form to FDA? There's also a requirement that you submit this form every 2 years. So this might be your biennial renewal submission, or you might have a status change. So are you a business that grew and you're no longer eligible for this qualified facility designation? Next, you'll have to check the box next to which criteria makes you eligible for this qualified facility designation. Is it because you're below that $1 million in annual sales? Or is it because you're less than $500,000 and a majority of those sales are going to qualified end users? So it's just check which criteria makes you eligible for the qualified facility designation. It's also required that a qualified facility has either identified hazards in their products and implemented preventive controls to control those particular hazards they identified, which is essentially basically what's in the full requirements of the preventive controls rule, or they can follow other food safety regulations to minimize these hazards. So those could be your state food safety regulations. And we'll talk about, what those are in Washington. And then finally, this form has to be signed, stating that the information is accurate and that the records are kept to support the qualified facility designation. And so I mentioned FDA prefers that this form's filed electronically, but you can also download it and mail it to them as well. So when do we need to file this form with FDA? So this needs to be filed before beginning operations. I know there's a lot going on when you're starting a business, but this is definitely something you want to get filed before you start moving food into commerce. And then this attestation form needs to be resubmitted to FDA every 2 years. If your business grows, you also have to notify FDA when the business is no longer a qualified facility. And so, you don't want to delay this process. You want to let them know as soon as you've gone above, that $1 million threshold, which would then make you fully subject to the full requirements under the preventive controls for human food rule. So I know that was a lot of information, rapid fire. So we'll pause here if anybody has questions.
Great, thank you, Erin, for that overview and kind of walking through the different calculations. I know that can kind of be a lot to intake all at once. So we wanted to open it up for questions if people want to write those in. And we did have one question come in during the presentation, and someone was wondering if you're a food pantry or other type of operation that doesn't sell their products, how do you kind of calculate where you fall, or how does this apply to those situations?
So generally, any food pantry, food bank, they're not going to be subject to these regulations. So there is an exemption for those types of nonprofits. I don't know if anyone from the Washington side wants to jump in and kind of speak to, what kind of requirements there are for food pantries and food banks. I know in California, we have some local food safety oversight for food banks in particular, but maybe that's a little different in Washington if somebody wants to jump in.
Yeah, this is Stephanie. So it's really going to depend on the types of activities that are going on. So of course, if there's food processing going on, then you would likely need to get a food processor's license. But in our state, most of the time, I think that they've been trying to partner with processors that already are licensed processors. So I don't know if anybody from WSDA has anything to add about that.
Not on the food safety side, but I guess just throwing in the organic component. There is also an exemption for those businesses that are making less than $5,000 in gross annual sales, gross annual income from the sale of organic products. So again, if you have no sales, then you would be exempt in that way. And if you're doing any processing on site, then that would also be exempt under the retailer processor exemption. So if you were making organic claims, then there's still sort of a carve out for those types of charitable organizations.
Thank
Great,
you for that
thank you.
addition. Yeah, Sarah, I appreciate that. Yeah, so there would be the exemptions still under the FSMA regulations based on who the buyer is.
Great, thank you. So I think we haven't had any other questions come in, so we'll keep on moving, but if something comes up and you want to ask it in the second half of the presentation, feel free to do so. I know sometimes when a lot of information gets presented at once, that can take a while for your brain to digest it. So feel free to go ahead and send in questions whenever you'd like.
All right, so we'll kind of end here, I guess, talking about the modified requirements under the preventive controls for human food rule for qualified facilities. So it's not essentially a full exemption. There are still things you have to do under this particular regulation, even if you're a qualified facility. So these qualified facilities are subject to the general provisions of the preventive controls for human food rule. They also have to implement good manufacturing practices. They have to, of course, submit that attestation form to FDA and also follow, certain labeling requirements. They have to follow record keeping procedures that apply to GMPs, that support their attestation, that comply with local or state food safety regulations. And it's also important to note here that the FDA has the ability to revoke qualified facility status if a foodborne outbreak occurs in products in one of these qualified facilities, or if egregious food safety issues are noted that could potentially pose a risk to human health. So the general provisions of the preventive controls for human food rule basically states that facilities are prohibited from selling adulterated foods. And so adulterated foods include those that pose a food safety risk, those produced under insanitary conditions, or those that are economically adulterated. And so adulterated food, it includes foods not only that are contaminated with microbial or chemical or physical contaminants, but those that are produced in a facility that's deemed, unclean. And so that's kind of where the GMPs come into play. There's also economic adulteration. If someone is, substituting a high value ingredient with something cheaper, but still marketing it as this high value product, that is also considered a form of adulteration. So the general, provisions here, this applies to qualified facilities as well as fully covered facilities. The next piece is good manufacturing practices, or GMPs. So we'll have a final webinar on GMPs, and also we're planning some upcoming workshops on the subject. If you're not familiar with GMPs and you need some support ASAP, Cornell's Institute for Food Safety has an online GMPs course, which is a great option if you need this sooner rather than later. But the basic components of these good manufacturing practices, or GMPs, are programs that help ensure that food is processed under sanitary conditions. So these GMPs apply to, these basic categories of operations. So personnel, making sure that folks understand, hand washing, and when hand washing is required, that they're, not wearing jewelry, wearing hairnets. It applies to, the equipment and utensils that you're using, making sure those are made of materials that can be cleaned and sanitized. So we'll go into more depth on each one of these in our final webinar. But again, if you can't wait until then, there's that online course from Cornell, as well as some other great guidance documents and resources through University Extension. So documentation for qualified facilities includes that attestation form and the supporting documents for the attestation. And documentation that shows the facility has either identified hazards for their particular products and is implementing controls for those identified hazards, or that the facility is complying with applicable non-federal food safety laws, so state or local food safety regulations. So in Washington, the Department of Agriculture has a requirement for food manufacturers to have a food processing plant license. So there's no exemption here based on size. However, the filing fees for this license do vary based on the size of the business. I will say I reviewed the application, and it's fairly in-depth, and it includes some of the basic information, location, number of employees, what you're making, that kind of thing, but also has these other attachments that are required that are, very related to food safety and good manufacturing practices. The application also has a question on whether an FDA attestation form has been filed if the business is a qualified facility. So just know that you'll, of course, need to be filing that FDA attestation form prior or alongside submitting this application for a food processing license. And listed here are, just some basic categories of foods that we're going to require this license in Washington. And then in terms of records, so, essentially you have to keep records of everything that you're doing related to these regulations, because inspectors aren't going to take, your word for it. They need to see that associated documentation. So in addition to keeping the records related to qualified facility status, records are also needed related to implementing the GMPs and other food safety programs. So these records need to be accurate, legible, and indelible. So basically, these need to be written in ink. They need to be, information needs to be written on those records at the time of the observation. And they should not be able to be tampered with. So permanent ink, if you're utilizing electronic records, there's certain requirements for those electronic records to make sure they can't be altered at any point in time. And all of these records, they need to be retained for at least 2 years and be made accessible to FDA for review upon request. So record keeping is really important, and it's a major thing that any inspector is going to be looking at when they come into your facility. And then finally, it's written in the regulation that the FDA can revoke qualified facility exemptions. This can occur if a foodborne illness is linked to the qualified facility, or if conditions within that facility are such that, based on the FDA's discretion, pose a risk to human health. So this could be, if those GMPs aren't being implemented, if a facility is not clean, those are all things that FDA, could look at as a reason to revoke a qualified facility status designation. And so there are a lot of great resources out there. We can't cover everything in a 1-hour webinar, but I would refer you to that FDA qualified facility website. That will get you to the forms that you need to file. Their guidance document also has more example calculations. There's many complicated models for food processors, and so they go through some of the nuance if you have multiple facilities and that kind of thing, how you would make those calculations. There's also some great resources available for food processors in the state of Washington. A few are listed here, but I think, our experts on the webinar today might have some other resources that they would recommend for folks processing in Washington as well. And so I'll stop here again and just see if there's any questions before we wrap up for the day.
Great, thank you. So yeah, I wanted to encourage folks to send in questions if you have any questions. And to start off with, just kind of looping back to that list of resources, I just wanted to note that we did put a PDF in the chat that includes a lot of those resources there. So that's available for folks now. And we'll also be sending out a PDF of the slides, and all those links will be there on the slide too. And so just to start off with, Stephanie, are there any other resources or recommendations you wanted to add for Washington food processors to what Erin has already included?
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to say that Washington State University Extension is here to help processors if they have any additional questions. So feel free to reach out to us. And then also, I believe that this was in the PDF already, but WSDA does have a handbook for small and direct marketing farms that has a lot of information on different regulations as well. So that can be extremely helpful. And if you're wanting, to even get started in processing, maybe you haven't ventured there yet, but you're just getting started, please do feel free to reach out to us for assistance.
Great, thank you. And so someone wrote in and was wondering, what are some of the common pitfalls for organic processors in terms of food safety? Given there are some restrictions on what folks can use in terms of sanitizers and whatnot.
Sure. Well, I guess the biggest one that I've seen a lot is just basically failure to integrate their organic system plan with their food safety plan. And so, whether you're a qualified facility or just trying to incorporate some of those good manufacturing practices into your overall food safety plan at your facility, if you are making organic claims, then you're required to have an organic system plan as well. And so we find that those businesses that integrate their organic system plan with those food safety plans have the most success in making sure that those practices are trained on and implemented consistently, and the records that are being used, if you have a record to verify that you're cleaning out your equipment, then making sure that you're getting those organic control points on that same record can really go a long way in making sure that those records are ready for your organic inspection as well. Some things that you do need to be aware of, though, are like records retention requirements, making sure that you're meeting all of those. I think I heard Aaron say 2 years for the preventive controls, but for organic, it would be a 5-year records retention requirement. And then you also touched on cleaners and sanitizers. I do feel like there's a misconception out there that, organic food processors can't use the same sanitizers to clean their equipment, or even those direct food contact materials. And there are a lot of allowed inputs out there. And the main message that I would give to you is talk to your certifier. Those inputs that you're using in organic processing need to be approved in your organic system plan, but we do use different criteria depending on what the material is and how you're using it. So, if you're cleaning break rooms and drains and floors and those types of like environmental materials, those pose little to no risk to your organic food. So we're not going to look at them as closely. But then on the other end of the spectrum, you have those post-harvest materials or sanitizers that you're using directly on the food. And those do need to be on the national list of allowed materials. But there's a lot of options there for you. Chlorine, PAA, citric acid, those are all allowed materials in organics as well. So talk to your certifier, explain what it is you're trying to accomplish, and update them if you're changing out those materials, but know that there's a lot of allowed materials out there.
Thank you. And another question came in. Someone was wondering if you could talk about any resources or information for businesses that operate in another state, such as Oregon, but want to sell across state lines within a 200-mile radius. So sort of still considered local under some regulations, but also crossing state lines.
So I would say, once something starts entering interstate commerce, right, that's kind of flags go up that, this is definitely going to be an FDA regulated product. There are certainly, you can potentially still be a qualified facility if, if you're selling is within that 270-mile radius of your home facility. But, I think anytime you're talking about interstate commerce, you need to look very closely at the federal regulations and make sure that you're compliant with those. But you would also want to familiarize yourself, with, what's going on in your neighboring states as well. Oregon State has a great food safety extension program. So if you have specific requirements about, kind of what the food safety landscape looks like in Oregon versus Washington, you can certainly reach out to them. But if you're producing in Washington State, that's kind of the main resource you're going to look to, and then also be very cognizant of these federal regulations, because anytime a product's moving across state lines, they're going to play a really important piece in dictating what kind of regulations you're going to have to follow.
Thanks. So another organic related question, someone was wondering if there are recommendations for processors who process both organic and non-organic products for preventing cross-contamination or commingling.
Sure. Well, along the same theme as like integrating it with your food safety plan, if you're working with allergens, it's going to be kind of a similar approach of trying to make sure that you're identifying these ingredients or products as they're coming into your facility to make sure that you're verifying that this does contain an allergen or this is an organic ingredient. And so making sure that as soon as it arrives at your facility, you're kind of doing that inspection step to make sure that you're, if you ordered organic product, that you actually received organic product, and then clearly identifying that. And often there will be practices to kind of segregate that product. If it's packaged, then there's not so much concern about it coming into contact with non-organic products, but it's more just about those practices to make sure that your staff are not going to confuse that ingredient with the non-organic form of the same ingredient. And so having a clearly identified segregated area to store your organic ingredients can help minimize the risk of confusing those ingredients. And so a lot of those practices we would expect to see in place and described in your organic system plan. And then any shared equipment where you're processing organic and non-organic, you'll need to have those practices in place to either make sure that you're starting with clean equipment when you go to process organic so that you know that there's no risk of non-organic products being on that equipment. Or if it's equipment that is hard to clean or you don't want to introduce water into that equipment. And so there's like dry cleaning. Sometimes we'll see purge practices where you'll run organic product through that equipment to make sure that you're pushing all the non-organic product out. And then that is sort of diverted to like a waste stream or something sold as conventional until you can be sure that anything else coming through that equipment is just organic product. And so we see those kinds of practices implemented all the time. As far as the clean down, we would expect that cleaning practice to be documented so that we can go back and verify that you were starting with clean equipment, or maybe your process is to just start with organic processing each morning after a night shift cleaning occurs. And so your production records should be able to verify that. And then with purge practices, we'd actually want to be able to see that those quantities were used to purge the equipment. And that should be able to be verified through some audits and a documentation step there as well. Let's see what else. I think those are the common strategies that we see. One last thing I'll say about purges is, depending on your equipment, you might be really erring on the side of caution as far as purging a large quantity of organic product through that equipment. But if you have some like validation steps in there to explain like how you determine that that purge quantity was sufficient. Those can be really helpful in making sure that your practices are sufficient. And yeah, let me know if there's any other questions.
Yeah,
If that
that's
didn't fully
great.
answer it.
No, I think that was really good, and that's helpful just to talk about the different strategies you can use to prevent that cross-contamination. So haven't had any other questions come in, so I think I'll just, if anybody has any final thoughts or resources they'd like to share before we sign off, I just wanted to open it up for that. And then we'll do a short wrap up and let you know about some upcoming events and other resources that are available. Oops. Looks like we've covered everything. And again, if you have questions that come up later and you want to follow up with speakers, we'll be sending out in the follow-up email that with the recording and the PDF of the slides contact information as to how you can get additional questions answered. And finally, we just wanted to run a poll to get more information on what type of other education events you would find useful in terms of food safety. So if you want to go ahead and fill that or click what you'd like to see, spend a little time doing that, whether it's the produce safety training or the preventative controls qualified individual training, the juice HACCP. I see there's a number of folks that are interested in basic good manufacturing practices. So we'll give that another second or two, let folks answer. And then I'll close it in a couple more. So we'll go ahead and end the poll and kind of share the results there. So looks like there's mixed interests, both a lot of interest in the produce safety rule grower training, as well as some basic good manufacturing practices, and as well as the preventative controls qualified individual training. So that's super helpful to know. And as Erin mentioned, we're planning more education events sort of as part of the series. So we will keep those suggestions in mind as we plan future workshops. So if you want to move on, speaking of future workshops, we have 2 more webinars in this series coming up this fall. So in November, we will get into the weeds on the preventative controls rule requirements for fully covered operations. And then in December, we'll get a review of good manufacturing practices, that some of which Erin mentioned today. So we'll do more full in-depth presentation on that. And then Erin, do you want to talk a little bit more about the feedback opportunity?
Sure. So I have another project where we're trying to develop some online food safety training for small scale food processors. And so to help make sure the training is meeting the needs, we're asking for processor feedback on what we're planning to develop. So if you're someone that is, kind of oversees food safety at your business and you want to have a chat with us, so it'll be less than an hour for sure. We'd love to have you participate. We are offering incentives, monetary, for your time. So feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about this, or you can scan the QR code here and go ahead and sign up. So thanks.
Great, thank you. And then Erin mentioned today our previous webinar, the FSMA 101 for organic food processors, that goes into more depth about the different compliance categories and helps folks figure out which compliance category they may fall into. So that is available on our YouTube page along with other webinars. So check that out. And then we also have some granting opportunities coming up. Erin, if you want to go on to the next slide. So our Brickmont Hardship Assistance Fund is open until November 5th, and that supports organic producers who have experienced hardship over the past year. And I know it's the pandemic has continued and has been continued to be kind of a rough time. So if you know anyone who might be interested in applying for that grant, please send it their way. You can find more about the eligibility and the qualifying criteria on our website. And it's a smaller grant. I think they run not around $1,000 and a little more. Larissa, if you want to jump in and add anything on that, feel free. And so we just wanted to acknowledge that there are other assistance programs out there that might be a little more robust, but this is something that we like to offer to organic producers. So that is there. And then we also have our Future Organic Farmer grants opening up, and they are open for FFA students until November 15th. So if you have a high school student in your life who is in FFA and interested in doing an organic focused project, send them to our website for more information. And Larissa, is there anything you wanted to add on the grants?
No, just quickly for the Brickmont, the funds are actually up to $2,500, which is
okay.
So
Good
we have
to
a little bit more range there. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
And then that is it. So thank you for joining us this afternoon or this morning, depending on the time zone you're in. And when you click out of the webinar, an evaluation form will pop up, and we just wanted to encourage you to fill it out, give us a little feedback on this webinar and some ideas for future programming. And thanks again to all of our speakers. We appreciate having you here today and giving a nice review of the math and all of the forms you need to fill out for your qualified exemption. So have a good day, and we'll see you all in November for the next webinar.